All right, and we're live. You want to go ahead and introduce? While we're here, yeah, just get up there, stand right to me.
Make sure we're in the camera. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our launch of the second edition of our Rent Control Toolkit. Very exciting day for us. And my name is Eduardo Torres. I'm a regional organizer with Tenants Together. My primary work has been in, I think, first of all, a lot of times when people think of like the housing crisis. Thank you. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. I think, first of all, when people think of the housing crisis, people obviously think of like the big cities like San Francisco, Oakland. But my work has been primarily done in Concord, which is also suffering, which is a suburban city in Contra Costa County that has been suffering with housing issues as well. And my work started with a building, 1127 Virginia Lane, where some tenants there were having issues with the slumlord and huge rent increases. And they started a a rent strike there. And that pretty much catapulted the city into to start going forward with a rent control campaign in Concord. And this toolkit will definitely come useful for the folks out there in Concord who don't have rent control yet. And I did invite a couple of tenants from Concord to be here, but unfortunately they couldn't make it. They couldn't get out of the work schedules. Obviously, it's hard for them to miss work when the rent is so damn high, right? So regardless, they are continuing to fight out there in Concord, and this rent control toolkit would be a huge asset to the fight, not just in Concord, but all across the state with communities who are fighting for housing justice. And speaking of that, I do have some cities that I want to give some shout outs who have local ballot measures for rent control that just got announced. Santa Cruz, Inglewood, yeah, give some props. Yeah. Glendale just joined the fight as well. They have a ballot measure. Pasadena and Long Beach. And there's active rent control campaigns at this moment in Sacramento, Santa Rosa, Concord, City of Alameda, Union City, Fremont, Hayward, Santa Barbara, San Diego, and Los Angeles County unincorporated. So again, this rent control toolkit is going to be very useful for all of those communities that are fighting for housing justice. And at this moment, I want to go ahead and introduce our Associate Director, Amy Inglis.
Thank you, Eduardo. So I am incredibly excited. I'm telling myself I'm not nervous, I'm excited. Because this little booklet represents the blood, sweat, and tears of organizers, activists, attorneys, counselors, you name it, all the folks in our movement who have been fighting for rent control for decades. Really, it's in California. It's been decades, and probably longer before that if we go through the arc of history. The fights now are very much rooted in a movement that most recently started in the 70s, in the 80s, and organizations that continued into this day. And we very much stand on those shoulders, but we're also not limited by what has happened in the past. And so we want to expand our movement and grow our movement. So part of that is folks here at the table, and not necessarily who you would traditionally think of when you think of tenant rights organizations. And really that is because this is a need that responds to the community, that responds to this broader goal of having healthy, thriving communities, which is why we titled this Communities Thrive with Rent Control, because that's the purpose. It's not just a policy in and of itself. The purpose is that we care about people in our communities, and we have love for those people who live here, and we want them to thrive and live and be safe in healthy homes. So it's really, this work is really important to me, and we take it really seriously as well. So we have a resilient and vibrant movement, and we know how to craft policy. We know how to organize. We know how to defend against lawsuits from the California Apartment Association. We know how to communicate to a broader world about our issue and why it's important. We are well-rounded, really smart, amazing people. And obviously, I'm not saying that just about myself, it's everyone here, and folks in the room as well. So I wanted to ground us in that and why we're here. And then I also wanted to connect these local fights to the statewide fight. So this is timely in particular because there's a bunch of campaigns already planned on the ballot for 2018. A few of them Eduardo mentioned, and there may be more. There's still time. And there's also a statewide ballot measure to repeal Costa-Hawkins. So all of those things are coming together, and it's after years of organizing, starting in 2015, passing rent control in Richmond. It was the first time in 30 years that a rent control law had been passed. People thought it wasn't possible. I've been doing this work for long enough to have been in rooms where you couldn't say rent control or you'd be thrown out and called a socialist. So the politics have changed, and people are realizing that this is a reasonable policy to defend our communities, and is growing in support. So I want to just briefly introduce the folks on our panel here, and I'm pulling this out so I get all their titles correct. So we have over on our left, Daniel Saber is a senior attorney at Community Legal Services, East Palo Alto. Kenneth Tang, community organizer with Asian Pacific Environmental Network. It's a grassroots environmental justice organization based in Oakland and Richmond. And we have Bradley Wiedmeyer, home care worker and member of SEIU 2015. Leslie Gordon, born and raised in Alameda, California, and is a master's student earning a degree in urban affairs. And as well as us releasing our toolkit, we're also releasing the amazing report Urban Habitat did in support of rent control. And then we have, last but not least, Tony Samara, Program Director of Urban Habitat and also a board member of Faith in Action Bay Area that does work in the South Bay and San Francisco. So I think if we will have folks take a few minutes each and just talk about, who you are, what you do, why is this policy in our community so important, and why do you do this work? So let's start to the left.
Yeah. Okay. I'll wait for this to come across.
Thank you, Amy. So as Amy said, my name is Daniel Saber, and along with Tony, I am attempting to fill in for Lorena, the Executive Director of Faith in Action today. And despite my very big rain shoes, she has very tough shoes to fill, so I'm going to do my best. I work at Community Legal Services in East Palo Alto. We're a nonprofit law firm that provides free legal services to lower income residents throughout San Mateo and now increasingly in Santa Clara County. But most relevant for here, we've been providing legal support to the rent control movement down along the peninsula for the last couple of years. And I wanted to start off by kind of just putting a finer point on, I think, what Eduardo and what Amy both said at the beginning, which is the kind of origin story of where did this whole thing come from, this rent control movement. And I think it's important, for as valuable and useful a resource as the toolkit is, we have to recognize that the rent control movement didn't start with a toolkit. The toolkit is a response to tenants and other residents and their allies rising up to demand that they're able to live with justice in their housing and with dignity as human beings within our communities. So really, this is a grassroots movement that is grounded in the lived experience of tenants, people of color, lower income communities who have been fighting back against the housing crisis. So there is certainly a policy goal that folks are aiming for, but it's coming from a place of the lived experiences of people actually in these communities who are feeling the impact directly themselves. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of different stories that we've seen in the work that I've been a part of, just to highlight, why are people clamoring for rent control so much now in the housing crisis. So one case I want to describe is a roughly 15 or 16 unit building in the city of San Mateo. So to your point, it's not just the big cities anymore. It's down in the heart of Silicon Valley that we're seeing this crisis. And this is a 15 or 16 unit building that is actually owned by a former city council member of a different city down in the peninsula. And this building has been infested with terrible conditions, including roaches, rats, mold, holes, problems with all of the piping. They've been cited by the code enforcement in the local city for numerous violations. And the tenants have been forced to live with these conditions while, at the same time, getting rent increases of hundreds of dollars year over year. And at this point, the rent in this building has been increased to roughly $3,000 a month while these conditions have persisted. And the tenants in this building have organized and they're fighting back against their landlord, but it highlights the problem that, without these sorts of tenant protections, given the tightness in the housing market and the lack of options that tenants have, people are forced to not only endure insane rent increases that very few people could afford, much less lower income people, but beyond that, they're forced to endure terrible conditions because they have so few other options. And so this, for a lot of the people that I've worked with when they describe this, it's not just a financial point about wanting the rents to be lower. It's about living with dignity and living in a home that you can be proud of and that you're willing to raise children in, which is both a place you can afford and a place that's healthy. And aiming for rent control, people know that that's one of the ways that we're going to be able to achieve those goals. Not only are we going to be able to keep these rents lower, but we're actually going to be able to hold landlords accountable to maintain their units. And we're going to have better mechanisms to do so. The other story that I would tell is just, and this is actually a broad story we've seen all across the peninsula and I think throughout the Bay Area, and it's really a story of speculation. What is driving the housing crisis? We hear so much, I think, in the public narrative about it's just a supply and demand problem, we just need to build more. And I don't think that captures the nuances of what's really happening. So one of the things that we have seen in the peninsula is speculators are coming into our communities, finding these apartment buildings that have reasonably affordable rent. It's not actually affordable, but relatively speaking it is. They come in and they buy these buildings with usually financing from some bank or another, and then they immediately, upon purchasing the building, do one of two things. They evict everyone. They'll send out mass eviction notices. So we've worked on cases, there was a 73-unit apartment complex where everyone got eviction notices. There was an 85-unit apartment complex in Redwood City where everyone received eviction notices, a 16-unit apartment building in Redwood City, et cetera. The list goes on and on. Mass evictions are happening due to the speculative investment where people come in and instead of wanting to be landlords, they want to get people out, do some light upgrades to the building, get new people in, and then sell it off. Basically unload this in order to turn a huge profit at the cost of all the people who actually lived there in the past. That's one of the things they do. The other thing they'll sometimes do, instead of evicting people with an eviction notice, is just increase the rent by $850. We have a case just last week where we had two buildings where the rents went up between $500 and $850. There were rent increases of 45% in this instance. The people who live there, they're experiencing this and they know that what's happening to them. They've lived in an apartment building for 10 years. They've paid their rent on time every month. They have been good tenants and they are now getting thrown out of their home through absolutely no fault of their own, just because some speculator wants to make a ton of money off of their home. And so that is what, at least in my experience, I've witnessed drives so many tenants and residents in these communities to demand that we have policies that will actually implement a better sense of housing justice than what we currently are seeing, which is just a free-for-all, out-of-control market process that's tearing apart our communities, ripping families apart, and is ultimately going to have a negative impact on everyone in the Bay Area if we can't maintain the diversity and strength of our communities. So that's where I see this coming from, and I'll pass it over a little bit to Tony to talk a little bit more about some of the organizational responses. Or we'll just go, okay, never mind.
Hi everyone, my name is Kenneth. Hi, Facebook. I'm a community organizer in Asian Pacific Environmental Network, APEN for short. APEN is a grassroots-based building environmental justice organization, and we have a vision to believe everyone has the right to clean and healthy communities where they can live, play, learn, and thrive. And a lot of people have asked us, even people walk through our office, like why is housing related to environmental justice? A lot of people think environmental justice is in climate change, pollutions. Why are you guys doing housing? That's a lot of concerns that people have or questions, and they are very relatable. And in terms of like climate change, we definitely know what problems come in with different hurricane, earthquakes, sea level rise. We know the impact that have in communities, but a lot of people always undermine like the social impact of different climate change. And because it definitely hurt the well-being of the communities, and some of the impact is as great as natural disaster. There's definitely, we often see gentrification where higher income, wealthy people come to a city that really drive the populations of people of color, especially immigrant communities. I myself come from an immigrant background. I was fortunate enough to access education here in the state to really learn the language. But immigrant families like my mom or others' parents, they don't have that fortunate to know the language. And because of the language barrier, it's really difficult to access jobs. And without access to jobs, it's really difficult to support the well-being of the family, to raise a family. They want to see their family, see their kids to be proud of. And definitely because of language barrier, the access to jobs, we often can only work at low-income jobs like restaurants, where they don't get to interact with people as much because they don't speak the language. And for them to really stay at their neighborhood, it's really difficult when rent burden is such a major thing in current crisis and different eviction cases. I definitely see more and more families in my work are getting drive out, getting displaced. And for my personal story, I personally look for like what I call cultural securities, because for immigrants family who come to a brand new environment with no friends, don't know the language, it's really difficult for us to survive. We often relied on people who speak the same language as us, or look for service who provide that language support. And we're definitely seeing that gentrification is displacing the culture of our neighborhood, of the community that we live in. So that's why I dedicate my work into addressing the displacement work in my community, and this is why I carry my work so much. We previously worked in the Postal Board in 2016, worked on protection local renter, Measure JJ, to really keeping communities at their home. And we also worked in end of last year, the A Stadium development, which will have huge impact to the community that we live in if it succeeds. But fortunately, we were able to stop that. And yeah, that's why I'm really here to really talk about why rent control is so important to my community and why we're here to stay.
Hello, my name is Bradley, and I am a resident here in San Francisco. I'm based in San Francisco, and it's great to hear about the efforts to accommodate people in the surrounding cities of the Bay Area. But my experience primarily is here, and we are seeing that San Francisco is becoming a bedroom community. It's becoming a place where people that are working elsewhere are coming here to live, big time, tens of thousands of people. This is putting tremendous pressure on the community that I'm familiar with as a California in-home health supportive worker in the IHSS program that cares for people who are seniors and disabled. Our population is under great pressure for displacement because of housing speculation. People who have a community are being driven away from their community. And speaking as a member of a union, the labor union, SEIU 2015, which is California's long-term care union, we are seeing this happening across the state. But here in San Francisco, we're facing this added crisis of having so many more people come to live here rather than just work in the city and the growth surrounding the city, but residential growth here in the city displacing people. We recently worked with UC Berkeley on a study that shows that the senior population will double by 2030. And here in San Francisco, though, our senior population is stable. And you may ask, why is that? I'm a person in their 60s, and the baby boom generation is arriving at retirement age. But the senior population is actually being driven out of San Francisco. People are being forced to leave the community that they have grown up with through their life that they have here. And so that's why the senior population is projected to remain stable here, because we're displacing so many seniors out of San Francisco and putting the pressure on the surrounding community. And it almost seems like it's an unofficial de facto policy of the city. I have experienced eviction attempts against a number of my clients and myself as well. And I think that we do need to support people across the Bay Area and California with the growth, with rent control. And my observation, humble observation, as someone trained in architectural history, I see that we are still not addressing the market in many ways. For instance, 100 years ago, after the earthquake and fire and the great need to house people after that, very large single unit SROs were built with insufficient facilities, bathrooms, and water closets. And those neighborhoods that built those stagnated. That was a problem because all of the low-income, small unit places were massed in certain neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods, for instance, Rincon Hill, failed. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be providing SROs today, I believe. I think they should be mixed in with other development, because the thing is, this segregation of people economically has contributed to the stigma, the stigma that's applied towards low-income housing. And I believe that every new development should be required to have multiple units, multiple kinds of units, so that you have a number of small units mixed with the units that everybody would like to be housed in. We're in a housing crisis right now. This is really serious. Out the window, across the street, there's a hotel that has on the side of it a ship form. And in the gold rush, when they arrived, they needed housing, and they used the ships. Right now, we only have so much housing, and we need rent control to help utilize that housing fairly. We need to modify our building laws so that small units and diverse incomes can be mixed together and required to be mixed together in every development. That's something we're not doing at all. And housing is still being built as a speculation. And the idea that certain communities will drag down a development is a problem that needs to be addressed in the future. But just as a worker, it's tragic when you see how the laws for eviction are played in the city and how things are done to try to get the elderly out. One client who had lived for 50 years in Russian Hill, obviously he had a view of Golden Gate Bridge, and his landlord turned towards connections in the city to use the infrastructure, the professionals in the city to assist in using the social safety network against this individual. And we had to fight that, we had to call them out, and it was just incredible because of the pressure that his unit, Rent Control, was potentially could rent for 3 or 4 times, and especially for short term. And the short term issue is another issue in San Francisco that is everywhere, but particularly severe here. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Leslie and I'm a researcher with Urban Habitat. Daniel, Kenneth, and Bradley spoke very eloquently about what's happening on the ground level and stories that are everyday realities for tenants. I'm going to talk a little bit more about policy and why rent control and just cause evictions are such important policies in our region during this housing crisis. First and foremost, Urban Habitat supports rent control and just cause evictions because we know that these policies protect tenants and guarantee fair returns to landlords. Rent control and just cause evictions policies help stabilize neighborhoods, which in turn create just economies and increase democratic participation. These programs are also cost neutral to cities. As a policy organization that approaches equity through a regional lens, we understand rent control and just cause evictions as anti-displacement measures with implications beyond housing policy. Displacement causes reverberations beyond individual families and beyond municipal borders. Local school districts, local businesses, and local governments are all negatively affected when their students, employees, and constituents must leave abruptly. We all see at this point that the housing crisis will require both local action and regional coordination. So I'd like to say a bit more about fair returns and rents. Rent control always allows for fair returns for landlords. It wouldn't be constitutional if it didn't do that. And right now, tenants in the Bay Area and other parts of the state are paying economic rents to their landlords, which means that landlords are making huge profits simply because they own properties in a hot real estate market and not because they're reinvesting in those properties to provide better and healthier housing for their tenants. And rent control is most important at precisely this moment, when urban land values are rising at unprecedented rates and we cannot produce affordable housing anywhere near fast enough to keep people in their communities. So I have a few stats to back that up. The National Apartment Association's 2015 nationwide survey of rental apartments shows that the San Francisco, Oakland, Fremont metro area had the highest net operating income and the greatest possible rent. This meant rents of $18.60 per square foot, and compare that to the low of $4.80 per square foot in the Dayton, Ohio metro area. And so we also know that rents have only increased since 2015. When a landlord believes that he or she isn't making a fair return, he or she can file an individual rate adjustment petition with the rent board and try to make his or her case. In 2016 in Santa Monica, not a single landlord asked for an individual rent adjustment. That is because they're making far more than fair returns. In Berkeley, only 37 of 2,800 landlords filed this petition. Again, that's because they're making far more than fair returns. This means two things. Rent control allows for fair returns, and if there is a situation in which a landlord believes they are not making a fair return, there is a clear remedy to file a petition with the rent board. I'll say a little bit more about supply. It's true that speculation is happening across the board, but it's also true that the market simply doesn't produce affordable housing. Urban Habitat believes in the 3 Ps of housing: preserve, protect, and produce. This means that we must preserve existing affordable units and protect tenants in place through rent control and just cause eviction policies, while also producing housing that is affordable for low-income residents of the Bay Area. The most recent Regional Housing Needs Allocation Progress Report shows that across the 9-county Bay Area, we have built 3% of our target for very low-income housing, 9% of our target for low-income housing, 4% of our target for moderate-income housing, and 28% of our target for above moderate-income housing. While there are gaps in all brackets, there's a very clear problem with the production of affordable housing. Urban Habitat's new report, which Amy mentioned at the beginning of this panel, is called Strengthening Communities Through Rent Control and Just Cause Evictions. And this report rebuts 11 of the most common myths about rent control. We did case studies of rent control and just cause evictions programs in Berkeley, Santa Monica, and Richmond to get to the bottom of the landlord talking points that we hear so often. The case studies show that despite the pressures of vacancy decontrol, recontrol, and the Ellis Act, rent control still protects marginalized groups. Tony, do you want to jump in on anything? Okay. So there's an argument we often hear which says that rent control doesn't actually protect the people who need help because it's not means tested. That's simply not true. First of all, renters make 1/3 to 1/2 of the annual salaries that homeowners make in our 3 case study cities. And also the Berkeley Rent Board's 2009 tenant survey shows that rent control does house extremely low, very low, and low income residents. Pre-1999 tenancies, which means before the enaction of vacancy decontrol, recontrol, did have higher rates of protecting marginalized renters, but post-1999 tenancies still comprise 56% low-income residents, with 38% of this group being very low income and 20% being extremely low income. That's very important, and it's so important that we continue to protect those renters. Post-1999 tenancies also include 17% disabled or senior residents. And so what we see is that rent control continues to provide tenants with stability and more affordable rents. And it is vacancy decontrol that has benefited younger, higher income tenants at the expense of elderly, disabled, and low income tenants. And so many times the arguments that are hurled against rent control are actually critiques of vacancy decontrol and the Ellis Act. And so when we talk about rent control, we must be much clearer about what we are actually talking about and be clear about which policies are harming tenants. And across the board, it's not rent control. Finally, I'll just say a bit about what Urban Habitat's vision for housing justice looks like. Housing justice would start with the repeal of Costa-Hawkins and the passage of rent control and just cause evictions across the state. In fact, 60% of California voters support rent control. One of the most harmful aspects of Costa-Hawkins is vacancy decontrol, recontrol, which creates perverse incentives for landlords to push out tenants and spike rents. Once units have been decontrolled and are rented at market rate, they turn over much more quickly, which accelerates the process of rising rents and population change. In Santa Monica, for example, 50% of tenants in decontrolled units have moved to Santa Monica in just the last 5 years. Housing justice really means that we are meeting the needs of our most vulnerable populations. And housing justice is inextricably tied to racial justice. As long as people of color live under the alternating threats of disinvestment and displacement, we have not met our needs. We have not met our goals for housing justice. The Urban Displacement Project at UC Berkeley, for example, has found that 87% of people of color in Oakland are undergoing or live under the threat of gentrification and displacement. Renters' ability to stay in their homes should no longer depend on the whims of the market. Ultimately, housing justice means recognizing that housing is a right. Our vision of housing justice at the policy level includes taking land out of the private market and using alternative methods such as community land trusts and limited equity cooperatives, which allow for long-term affordable housing and the fair and democratic management of land and housing. We must acknowledge that all layers of our lives are connected to having a comfortable, affordable home. Housing stability is the basis of our lives as workers, students, parents, immigrants, and faith congregants. Our housing policies must reflect that.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tony. I'm with Urban Habitat and also on the board of Faith in Action Bay Area. Faith in Action is a network of faith communities that works to uphold the dignity of every person. And when you listen to what Daniel and others have described in terms of the conditions that people are living under, what we're talking about is an assault on human dignity. It is a bedrock of human rights law and understanding that right to a decent home, right to live without fear of displacement are fundamental to what it means to be a human being and live with dignity. And so in terms of why the organization Faith in Action decided to work on housing and on tenant protection specifically, I think for any organization that works with communities directly and is made up of members from working class, low income communities of color, over the last however many years, it's been impossible to not be confronted by the housing crisis. And so whatever issue an organization happens to work on, whether it's education, whether it's transportation, whether it's climate, if you're working in communities, you're seeing the housing crisis, it's confronting you. And in that situation, organizations can either choose to confront that and address it and work on that issue, or they can turn away. And Faith in Action decided that it had an obligation to work on the displacement and housing crisis in both San Mateo and San Francisco counties. Now, in terms of why rent control, I mean, I think it's fairly straightforward, and Leslie and others have touched on this. It's a reasonable policy and it works. But I think beyond that, it's also one of the few policies, or two policies, if we also talk about eviction protections, that can actually begin to stabilize the very communities that are bearing the brunt of the displacement crisis. So it's not just about protecting individual households, it is about that, but it's also about defending communities that have always been pressured throughout U.S. history to move when market conditions or other communities decide it's time for them to move. There are really no other policies if you're really serious about preventing displacement and stabilizing communities that can have such a big impact so quickly. In Richmond and Mountain View, both of which passed rent control last year, literally within weeks and months, tens of thousands of people are protected. And we just don't have other policies that can do that. Now, no one I've ever talked to or worked with on rent control has said, once we win rent control, we're done. Housing justice is achieved. We can go home, right? Because that's one of the critiques you always hear. Rent control won't solve the housing crisis. Like, well, thanks for the update, but we kind of knew that. The problem is you can't really organize communities to fight for longer-term solutions if they're not there. You can't really get low-income communities excited about long-term policies if they just got an $800 rent increase. There needs to be some level of stability for those communities to build and preserve political power. And that's one of the other benefits I think that rent control policies and eviction control policies have, is that they allow that stability through which people can build community power. I think the other piece of this is that, and Eduardo mentioned this earlier when he listed all the different places where rent control fights are happening. This is not just happening in one jurisdiction, it's not just in one region, it's statewide, it's national. And when people who are most impacted begin to organize around the displacement crisis, these are the policies they go to. Why? Because they don't have the luxury of kind of debating XY policies. They need to do something that's going to have an impact immediately. They need to deal with the crisis as they live it, and these policies go some way towards actually doing that. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists. At this time, we're going to open it up to Q&A. So you guys have some questions, this is the time to ask them. Not all at once. No one has a question for our panelists?
So I would like to ask Kenneth, would you like to describe more the challenging and the problems the Chinese community are facing in this city and the Bay Area? Yeah.
Yeah, beside on top of what I said, it's all about like building that communities. And without really communities, there's nothing really to rely on. We have to like survive on our own. That's where we really organize to really build power. And to the challenge where there is rent control in Oakland, but there is peace around like accessing in that in those policies. A lot of people that come into our door that with eviction notice, we really want to help them, but it's too late because either they receive a letter of eviction, they don't understand it, they don't know what to do, they don't know where to go, and by the time they found somebody, it's already too late because there's a certain time period where they have to respond, and they are forced to be evicted to out of the neighborhood or just out of the city. And when people try to lay root in their cities, you're pretty much getting uprooted to another place, which is like a really challenge if you want to raise your kids in a immigrant communities, where like access to school, transportation become even more challenging for those.
Any other questions? Okay, I think we're done. Oh, one question.
Does anyone on the panel want to speak to either the previous toolkit or this toolkit and how it was helpful or why it's important? No pressure.
I can start us off, and if any others have other thoughts. I think, so in the work that I've been doing, we've been supporting local movements for rent control in a number of different jurisdictions. And specifically, I've been supporting the rent control campaigns in San Mateo, in Burlingame, in Pacifica, in Mountain View, et cetera. And we had a number of different cities who were moving these campaigns forward simultaneously. And really throughout the entire region, we had a bunch of campaigns. Like in the 2016 election, there were 5 cities considering new rent control laws and 3 others that were strengthening their rent control laws at the same time. And one of the things that we encountered across jurisdictions was it became very clear that the real estate industry is incredibly well organized in addition to being incredibly well financed. And so we noticed that we were coming up against the same stock arguments in city after city. We even saw mailers that had the same messaging in the North Bay, the South Bay, the East Bay, you name it. There were some instances where we even had literally the same mailer go out in a bunch of different cities, just repeating the same tired old arguments. And so one of the things that I think is a really fantastic upgrade in this toolkit is identifying what some of the most common misinformation that's being put out there by the opposition and really deconstructing it so that when communities take this on, they're able to anticipate the kind of nonsense that they're going to hear in the campaigns and be prepared to respond very swiftly to that. I think a lot of people intuit the responses to a lot of the misinformation that is being blasted on the airwaves by the landlords and their friends. But having it laid out so methodically in this new toolkit is, I think, a really fantastic step forward for the tenants' rights movement as a whole, so that we're not ever going to be as well financed as the real estate industry that's making record profits off of this speculative cycle that we're in, but we can be just as well organized, if not better. And I think having this toolkit as a resource to the tenants' rights movement writ large is a fantastic way of supporting those grassroots efforts with this kind of broader messaging support.
Well, I just wanted to, I was so shocked in the Daly City rent control fight. You know, I mean, the fact that something as ridiculous as calling rent control a tax and, you know, just taking that to the hilt was really a terrible surprise. You know, and sometimes it takes a few whiles to learn the tricks of the opposition. The speculators basically are watching out for their money, and we have to catch up. Although sometimes really great ideas go through cycles. If people remember, their turn of the century, there was an effort for ranked choice voting, and Maine just passed a ranked choice vote a few years ago, although it's being challenged in court. But I think the same thing is due for rent control because it's a similar kind of organizing and defense mechanism for the people against the rule of the speculators, which, you know, basically is what our system is. And so I'm looking forward to seeing the toolkit being deployed to cut off this kind of complete falsehood and a way to get a hook on it so that with less money and people power, we can spread the word and make sure that the nonsense against rent control does not triumph.
Thank you. Any more questions? Wheels have been turning? Nothing? Okay, so I think we'll close it out. But before we do, I just want to let the folks watching on Facebook know if where to get a copy. You can go on our website, tenantstogether.org, and you could download a digital copy. So if you don't have a physical copy, visit our website at tenantstogether.org. You need a copy? Okay, he has a question.
So, release, do I need to, mic?
How you doing? So, Spur released a report in 2014 that said that roughly 45% of the San Francisco housing stock is under rent control. So, with the booming business that's coming to San Francisco and experiences here, as we increase rent control, do you fear that as we increase rent control across the city and more jobs relocate to the city, which brings more people, do you fear that pushing rent control within San Francisco will create a more housing problem?
You're a resident in San Francisco.
Well, I wanted to put out, I think we're still not approaching the need to build in the right way. I mean, right now we need micro units, and they need to be mixed in with the other projects, and we're not getting them. And there doesn't seem to be a route towards that. They're not required. And there's this whole economic segregation thing going on with housing that's reinforced in many ways. And you know, San Francisco has had times in the past when we have had incredible housing pressure. If you look at, I'm putting on my architectural history hat, but during World War II, units were put everywhere in the fly houses of theaters, you know, in the spaces. The community, you know, built and did what they had to. You know, it's, as a community, I think we can do it, but we have to be creative. And I don't think that cutting people loose from their housing by eliminating rent control is any way to stimulate the market to address these issues. It has to be a combination of the government and community leaders and organizations like San Francisco Foundation and others that are looking at solutions instead of just making money. It's like the question with the moratorium and the mission. You know, for the long term, there's only so much there are only so many sites and property. And that was to divert those sites towards affordable housing. And that was the issue when the market housing was gobbling up all the available open sites at this point. So it's not blaming rent control for the crisis. It's sometimes the success of the city, the success of the tech industry is, a problem. It's a challenge, but we have to get creative to deal with it, and eliminating or restricting or weakening rent control is not the solution. We need to protect the communities and not protect speculation.
I'll also add one thing. We argue that tenant stability is just. It ran out of battery. Oh, okay. I'll just try to speak loudly. We argue that tenant stability is just as good a thing as homeowner stability. So there's universal agreement essentially that homeowners should be able to stay where they live, and families that are homeowning families deserve stability. And we want to extend that argument to renters, and renters deserve to stay in place, and rent control is what allows them to do that.
And if I could just tack on to that, I think you said this, I think earlier, from a tenant's perspective, it is clear and cannot be questioned that rent control works. For tenants, it absolutely works. And I think that some of what we hear in some of the public debate around this is critiques about rent control not really working. And I think when we evaluate rent control and strengthening rent control in a place like San Francisco, we got to figure out, is this thing working, or would an increase in the strength of rent control work for whom? So I think, for me, if we strengthen rent control in San Francisco and we have better protections for, I don't know what the numbers are, but if it's 45% of the units, roughly half of the population, that's really good for tenants. And I think really good for San Francisco as a city. I think it's really bad for speculators and folks like that who want to come into our communities in order to make a buck but not really contribute in any meaningful way. And so I think I would urge all of us, as we hear those talking points from the opposition, to try and understand whose interests are really being promoted there. When it's the developers and the speculators telling us that rent control's bad, it's bad for them, perhaps, but really good for the rest of the community, which is way larger as a portion of the community than the speculators or the high-end developers who are telling us that rent control is somehow bad for us.
All right. Any more questions before we wrap up? No? All right. Well, thanks to SF Foundation for hosting us, and thank you for coming. Thank you so much.
And definitely
Oh, hey, yeah, we spoke before about the immigration tenant stuff. Yeah, it's nice to meet you. That's okay, no worries.
Anyway, just say hi.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah,
In fact, I'm glad that you're able to come down for this. Things are getting up in Sacramento.
Yeah,
It sounds like.
I'm hearing that, so we're going to talk to them today.